Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Jody Rose Platt with the Department of State, and I'm happy to open today's program on behalf of our embassy in Nigeria. We are so pleased to see the interest on this very important topic. The program will start with a brief introduction from Sam Aitoro, who will moderate the program. Sam is the Executive Director of Yiaga Africa and alumnus of the International Visitors Leadership Program. I will introduce one of today's speakers, Professor William Brown, who will speak for approximately 20 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session. We will then be joined by Dr. Amina Salihu, who will give a short presentation, followed by another question and answer session. We encourage all of you to send in your questions via the chat box, which is located on the lower right corner of the screen for your questions. We will be taking questions from the chat box to pose to our speakers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you very much, Jody, and it's good to see you this morning. And good morning to you all, or afternoon, wherever you find yourself. We're very, very glad and delighted you're able to join us for this call. Thanks to everyone who signed up for this webinar. We're very excited about this program. And as Jody mentioned, this is a webinar focused on civic leadership in a post-pandemic era, and it's exclusive for executive directors and team leaders of civil society organizations, social enterprises, as well as community-based organizations. As you know, the whole world is grappling with the pandemic called COVID-19 or novel coronavirus, and there are several names that have been called or have been tagged. But as you know, we're facing one of the worst pandemics in our history. And this is affecting how both governments, civil society organizations are thinking or doing their business. And for us, we thought it was very strategic to have this conversation. First, to look at how this is impacting your work and what can you do in response, as well as cushion the impact of this pandemic, but also explore the opportunities that this pandemic provides us. And that's why we're so excited to be hosting this. And thanks to our partners, the Public Affairs section of the US Embassy in Abuja, thanks to Jody, thanks to Lee, and all those who are working behind the scene. My colleague Cynthia Ibrahim, who are also working tirelessly to pull this off. But I also want to, especially on behalf of Yiaga, thank Professor Brown and Dr. Amina, who will be speaking to us. As Jody mentioned, please, you'll be posing questions to the speakers on the chat box just at the lower end, the right end of your screen. And please send us your questions and we will definitely attend to those questions. Let me turn over to Jody to introduce our first speaker, who will be speaking to us on the topic of the day. Jody?
Thank you so much. On behalf of the embassy and its partners throughout Nigeria, I am very pleased to introduce Professor William Brown. Professor Brown teaches at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He also serves as the director of the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. He teaches courses on nonprofit management, social innovation, entrepreneurship, and human resource management. His research focuses on nonprofit governance, strategy, and organizational effectiveness. He has much to share with you, and he also hopes to learn from you as well. Professor Brown, thank you so much for joining us this morning, very early Texas time, I know. We are very pleased to have you here, and I will turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Jody Rose. It's a pleasure to be here. Sam, it's good to join you this morning, or this afternoon, as you say, around the world. So it's fun to be able to participate and share a few thoughts. I agree. I value these conversations. I value these opportunities to be able to share a little bit of my perspective, some of how I think about nonprofit organizations. My perspective and approach tends to be organizational, as you'll see, and I think the two speakers today will complement each other very well. And as I say, I'm looking forward to my conversation. So I'll go on ahead and get started. I think I can share my screen, and I'll go on ahead and do that and make sure that folks can see my presentation. Give it a second there to load. So yeah, I've been at Texas A&M University for about 15 years, and it's been a pleasure to be able to help move forward some of the stuff that we're trying to do with helping managers, helping people like yourselves. A real shout out, I agree with Sam. I just really appreciate everybody who's helped put this together, but in particular, all of you who are doing this really important work. I mean, it comes up, I hear it all the time being at a place like the Bush School that thinks about its work at multiple levels, operating in a local environment, operating all the way internationally, and the importance of community action and the community work that you all are doing is just fundamental. It's a core piece of how our society functions and operates. And so anything I can do to give a little bit of perspective, but just hats off to all the work that you're doing. And the more I engage and interact with folks who are in the field, my hat goes off to you. And so I hope that some of this provides is useful and some nice perspective. I'll talk for a little bit, Sam, and for those of you here, and feel free to use the chat box and insert those. And I know at some point they'll be feeding them over to us. Sam, feel free to interrupt if something I'm doing is a little unclear, or if something comes through and people are looking forward to that. I miss the interaction, but happy to be here virtually with you. Let's see, here we go. All right, so what I'm going to try and cover, or we'll try and cover at least in this first part of this session. So we'll go for 45 minutes or an hour, I guess, and then I'm going to talk, as I say, for about 20 minutes, and then try to be able to have a good conversation. But as I say, I'm organizational and strategy, so I want to try and be able to introduce you to some of those key ideas, or talk through some of those, and in particular in reference to the unique operating environment or the context that we're operating in now and what that means. Thinking a lot about communication. For those of you who have been through kind of crisis situations before, many of you have probably gone through unstable environments, operating in unstable environments. And so, you know, the importance of maintaining a good, solid communication with our stakeholders. But I'll also give you some perspectives on fundraising, thinking a little bit about how we manage our fundraising and the things that we can do. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is help you to strengthen your organization so that you can have the kind of benefit that you really want it to have. As passionate individuals that are committed to the purposes of your organization, sometimes the organizational management stuff can feel like it's a burden or a challenge, but we know that building healthy, vibrant organizations that are resilient, that extend the purposes of who we are, and really get people to become committed to to what we do, makes all the difference. So we can see it around the world in organizations like this. And so I hope this helps a little bit in giving you some thoughts in reference to that. Specifically, I'll touch on each one of these ideas here around the environment, around, I always like to touch just as a quick reference on the activities of organizations, and then I'll get into some management ideas around strategic thinking, communication, community engagement, fundraising, and I'll try and, I'll have to move fairly quickly to get through those, but as I'm talking about a particular slide, again, I want to encourage you to because the conversation is really the best part. Just a quick brief here in reference to sort of some steps, some things we think about. This is what we're talking about to our organizations, all the organizations that we're talking to now as they are in the midst of what all of us are doing, both trying to understand the situation and our activities and the way that we're going to try and be able to move forward and the nature of that. And so I ask you the fundamentals here have to do with understanding our current situation. And so sort of this first bit here, right? So how do we understand who we are and what we're doing in reference to the current situation? And this includes engaging your board, putting in place some planning elements, evaluating your situation in reference to financials. And then a second element is, and some of you have already been engaged in this, is thinking about how do we take advantage of whatever relief is available. So we'll talk about funding sources. We see that funding entities are going to have a responsive element, and then there's going to be a long-term element, and we try to take advantage of the responsiveness. People are trying to make a difference. People want to connect with the work that you're doing. And then a fundamental message today is it's really important that you keep your fundraising and your cultivation activities going. You don't want to shut these down or somehow prioritize other kinds of activities. Another acknowledgement, I talk about a lot of stuff and it can get overwhelming. And so I encourage you to think about how this fits for the kind of organization you are, for the place you're at, for the kinds of work that you're doing. So just a quick sort of reference here for the kind of environment we're in. So from an organizational or from a management standpoint, we talk about sort of stable versus turbulent environments. We're often working in turbulent environments with the nature of complex stakeholder relationships, engaging constituencies, variety of individuals in reference to who we have to think about. But in a time like this, when literally the experts are trying to figure out what's going on with this virus, what's the way that the virus functions and operates, how does it transmit, what is it that we need to do for our social and our policy implications, what does it mean for our economies, it can be very difficult to predict. And yet, as a leader of a social organization, of a nonprofit, of an NGO, it's critically important that you seek to try and gain some degree of understanding, and that you do need to pay some attention, but also this ability to be able to provide a sense of continuity, if you will, and so that the recognition that you want to minimize sort of the angst, if you will, or the concerns, but while at the same time trying to be honest about our perceptions of the organization, about who we are and what we're able to do. And then, as many of you know, the value of just being optimistic and putting in place the hope that our work and what we do in our organizations and what we're trying to create, and continuing to sort of resonate with the optimistic elements of who we are. A key piece of operating in an environment like this is continuing to gain clarity about who you are as an individual, your capacities, the people around you. Who is it that we have engaged in our organization, and to what extent can they contribute to what's going on? What are their capabilities? And then we think about the systems of our organization. What do we have in place? What are the programmatic elements? What are those things that we know in reference to having an honest perception about who we are as a set of individuals working toward a particular mission or purpose. And then we also, it's critically important to think about the network or the range of connections that you're relying on to be able to get connected and stay connected with your external environment. And so while that is always an extra layer of work for us to maintain those relationships, the challenges of cooperation and coordination are deep. It's never been more important than in a situation like this, where we maintain those relationships. A key component of resiliency is our ability to stay connected with the constituents and in our networks. Putting in place appropriate plans are critically important, but ultimately action is also a fundamentally important aspect of this, and that we can't sit and wait. Sometimes you need to act and then react. Just a quick brief, I found this to always be a useful slide when I talk to folks in your operating, when you're like yourselves. Just a quick reminder that nonprofit organizations or NGOs or social service organizations carry out a wide range of activities to achieve the public benefit objectives. So public benefit, I'm talking about really our social change to have our impact. And this is just a quick reminder that many of us are engaged in service activities, but just as well, we're building social capital, and oftentimes we're engaged in political work to change and think about the political systems that we operate in. Those are three sets of activities that are really fundamentally different, and it's important to think about how those play themselves out in our organizations and the nature of those. And then many of us are involved in preservation, or a key piece of the nonprofit sector is its capacity in regards to innovation. and the way that we contribute and think about the work that we do and think about creative ways of approaching our work. When you look at solving social problems, we look to nonprofits, we look to NGOs, we look to community-based organizations to come forward with the ideas and the innovative approaches. We look to people like you to say, here's some ideas about how we solve these social problems. And so I just want to encourage that as well. So a key piece of what I do in my graduate class on nonprofit management is helping my students think through some of these ideas about what it means to be a strategic manager or a strategic leader. What are those elements in reference to being a strategic thinking and positioning yourself in a way that's responsive, but not necessarily reactive. And so some of this is a reoccurring theme that you're going to hear throughout this message is the importance of understanding ourselves, understanding our organization, understanding our capabilities, and then understanding the operating environment, understanding the funders, understanding our communities, understanding who it is that we're trying to serve and the nature and the needs and the concerns that they have. Putting together those two key elements, and while this diagram is kind of goofy, it really is actually touching on a lot of key ideas about things that are happening inside our organization in regards to things that are happening about our capabilities, and then the external environment and the way that we operate and function within that broader environment. We also look to leaders of organizations to provide a bit of a long-range perspective. And while the day-to-day can become overwhelming, it's important to try and consider about how we see the long-range vision. So many of us have powerful visions that motivate us to stay in the work that we're doing, motivate us to become engaged. And it's important to continue to sort of have those perspectives and put in place some plans and some ideas about what that means. Again, you see the importance of creativity, being openness to innovation. Oftentimes people can get themselves locked in and innovation can feel like a threat or a challenge. Careful consideration of resources, where they go, how we use them. And this is a broad range of resources, right? So this is about the people that we have. This is about the commitments that people have made to us. This is about the money that we allocate, the infrastructure systems that we can utilize and take advantage of. And then the sixth element here on this slide talks about the importance of measures and being able to talk confidently about what we do and how we make a difference, how we impact the work that we do, talk about who we serve and the nature of that. So while you put all of these elements together, it begins to give you some ideas about how and what way can I be implementing some of these. So I look forward to hearing from you in reference to how you try to do this, what you struggle with as you try to balance some of these different ideas of understanding who you are and putting in place long-range perspectives. So these are areas, okay, so this is just a quick overview slide that says, okay, this is our organization in a lot of ways. We cover a lot of different considerations, a lot of different areas. Typically when we talk to people in organizations, nonprofit organizations, they can talk quite coherently about their programs. They certainly can talk about the things that they want to try and do, the way that they deliver services, how they understand the importance of them. Many of you have probably worked on logic models to build the things that can do, that justify and can explain why you do the things that you do and how you anticipate those will achieve the benefits that you're looking to be able to achieve. So related to that though then is, from that, we need to take our programs and we need to build systems and make sure that we have systems in place to both be able to engage constituencies, to be able to explain to people what we do, who we serve, how we serve them, and the nature of that service activity, so that we can raise the resources that we need to be able to make a difference in our organization, to be able to put in place the kinds of fundraising elements that we need to put in place. And for those of you who've been in the field for a long time, you know how important it is to sort of gain that fundraising perspective or sense of resource development. where we begin to really be able to think about how we communicate who we are. That happens because we can engage people in our organization, whether it's volunteers, whether it's paid staff, whatever the nature of that is. We create a space where people can come together to serve the constituents that are critically important to us, to achieve the objectives that are fundamentally important. And as all of you know, that can't be done without a good financial management, without an accounting system, without a system that tracks and monitors the kinds of things that we need to be able to tell people about, in particular with our money, but also with our programs. And then this is culminated by good leadership. And here I oftentimes ask people to think carefully about their board. And that a lot of my work is helping organizations think about the way that they work with their boards of directors. And so I look forward to chatting a little bit about that as well. What's the nature of working with your nonprofit, with your board, and what's the extent to which you are able to do that, and how successful you are, and the frustrations inherent in sort of that. But also as an individual and as a leader of your organization, putting in place some of these leading components. So that's a lot of stuff. But fundamentally, if you're stepping into these organizations, or you're leading these organizations, that portfolio is something that's constantly on your mind about how I address each one of those different components. So if we talked about assessment, literally now you could sort of go through in your mind, you could talk to people around you and begin to make judgments about how satisfied are we with the way that we deliver and design our programs? How satisfied are we the way that we implement and communicate with people on our social media? What's the nature of our fundraising system? And do we have the cycle in place where we can identify, cultivate, and can we steward individuals who've given to our organization? What's the nature of, so you can see how the assessment that I talked about before plays itself out in the nature of these functions, if you will, is the word that I use to describe this. The functions of management allow you to be able to think about how we're functioning or operating. And as I've said before, I often find that people are oftentimes fairly comfortable with their programs. It has to do with all of the rest of it that becomes areas of concern for us. And so let me see if I can get into a few of these and give you a few thoughts, see if they're helpful and useful. So one, during a time like this, is continuing to communicate with people. And I find this, it's actually an area that I don't come to naturally in some ways, is thinking about how you are engaged in a communication and marketing kind of element, if you will, if you're comfortable with that phrase. I find some folks are. But the reality is we need to be able to help people understand who we are and what we're doing. And so I find these layers actually quite useful. This idea that there's a group of individuals close in, oftentimes highly committed to us, much more almost familial or family oriented. But this communication with that group of individuals happens maybe maybe daily, being able to both talk about information, but receiving information from these individuals. And really what you're trying to do is to empower a core group of folks to be able to make decisions, to operate your organization, to operate for the objectives of the organization in a way that really achieves those objectives. Again, we're talking about our ability to be able to achieve our mission objectives. But without a core group of individuals that are committed and on the same page, it can be quite difficult. So from that, we need to think about how we communicate with the next group outside, so that next level, right? So this group of individuals, and can you clarify for me who that is? Can you give me their names? Can you tell me about the nature of what their relationship is with your organization? So these people have familiarity. They're aware of who you are as an organization. If this is your organization in the middle, they're aware of your purposes, and they have a relationship with you or have had a relationship with you in some capacity. So we look to talk to these folks maybe on a weekly basis. It tends to be a bit more formal in our communication, but sometimes there's some informal elements to this as well, right? Because in some ways they're sort of insiders in our organization. They connect us to the broader community. They help us facilitate. And part of what we want them to be able to do is to have confidence about who we are in the core here, so that they can advocate for us to this external constituency, right? Because we need this sort of middle loop here to communicate and to advocate for us with the constituents that they interact with in the broader community. And so in those instances, that communication tends to be a bit formal. Sometimes we provide information, we tend to be able to facilitate. But part of what we're trying to communicate is, here's what we need you to do in this environment, whether we need you to provide support, whether we need you to be able to think about particular social behaviors, whatever it is that we're looking for this intermediary loop to facilitate our capacity to have the broader community impact. As somebody who's constantly facing the need to communicate, this ability to be able to clarify who my audience is and who I want to try and talk to becomes really a very valuable tool for me. And so I use that idea all the time. This one's a little trickier to see, but I actually like this. It comes from this article here that talks about how is it that organizations like yours create wealth. Civic wealth is the phrase that the authors use. And really what they're saying is that you as an organization are here in the middle, and that your capacity to connect with your community, so the people around you, your capacity to connect with elements of support, whether that's international aid or whether that's other philanthropic organizations, whether that's individuals and the way that they might give to your organization, in conjunction with the organizational form that you have and the way that you think about your enterprise, if you will, or the way you think about your organization, bringing these together, these different components, these different stakeholders, is fundamentally your job in some ways as a leader of an NGO. How do we facilitate the capacity to bring in these different components? And we've all seen examples of organizations that are lopsided, right? We've seen examples of organizations that are too much embedded in the regimes of support, connected to the funding streams in a way that they're not as connected with their communities as they need to be. Or we see examples when they're really just businesses operating for private purposes and private benefit. And so this ability to balance between these three components, and don't for a moment imagine that I'm assuming that this is an easy initiative. In fact, it's a fundamental component of the challenges of your work, is your capacity to balance these multiple constituencies and to be able to talk to them in different ways. When you talk to your community, it's a different way than when you're going to talk to the people who are supporting your organization. And it's furthermore, it's another way to be able to think about some of what's available for you. Oh, I'm getting the cue that I need to keep moving and move to some questions, because we got a lot hanging out there. So let me just go through a few more slides. These are available for you, so you can download these, you can gain access to them. You can see them here in reference to a reference as some things to think about. So a few more thoughts about how we engage the people close into us. A few thoughts about how we engage a few thoughts about how we engage our communities. And really what this one does is it recognizes these four steps here, and that we help people become aware of who we are. We hope that they have positive perceptions about who we are. We want to build their sense of attachment, and we want to provide opportunities for them to be able to engage with us. So that's a really simple idea about engagement, but I found that just that very level, and recognizing that you move from one to the next, and that we're clear about what our opportunities are when we've got a sense about what their attachment is to our organization. So I don't want to rush over this too much, but I do want to get this, and I do want to be sensitive to the fact that you've got probably questions that are queuing up there. And so a key message here, this is one we've been saying to everybody that we're talking to, is right here, right? If you felt that you had purpose and that you were of value, that doesn't go away just because you're having trouble being able to figure out how to be able to deliver your services now in a different environment. So part of what we're going to try and talk about is how do we balance this, what our purposes are in this new environment. Other things to remind ourselves is there's going to be immediate response funding, but also people are long range, or funding systems are long range, and our ability to be able to tap into both immediate and long range is critical. This slide is great. Encourage you to take a look at some of these. These are drawn from another faculty member here at the school, that just really some basic fundraising tips in regards to an environment like this. The takeaway here is sort of this one. We're sensitive to the condition, but do not stop your fundraising activities, because your capacity to re-engage at some point is that much harder. So continue to communicate with your constituents and talk to them about what you're doing. And this slide's full of a whole set of sort of tips and ideas. And I encourage you to pick on any one of those if you want to ask me a question about that. Just a quick reminder that I believe in the way that you, the logic of your service. You need to believe in the logic of your service, the rationale for the activities that you do, but a recognition that our service methods are going to have to change. And some of that's very much specific to who you are as an organization. This last slide is just simply a reference to the really kind of summarizes and brings together a variety of leadership perspectives and ideas and concerns in reference to how we really lead our organization. So this comes back to some of those initial things: helping interpret, making decisions, recognizing our need to coordinate, both connect and at times be able to recognize when it's important to move ourselves away from particular systems as they begin to evolve. So some of these key ideas are there again. So perhaps with that, Sam, it makes sense for us to move to the stuff to the conversation. Let's see if I can get you guys back and stop sharing the slides. Let's see, there it is.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Brown. Thanks for that very interesting presentation. I like some of the thoughts that you shared about communication. It's very critical at this moment. And I just want to perhaps start by asking why you think communication is key at this material time, but to also add to a question that we've gotten from our participants. And there's a question here that, please, can you shed more light on how we can approach innovation as a challenge, not as a threat?
So communication and innovation.
Yes. So there's innovation. The first question is on communication. Why communication is very, very critical at this particular moment. And the second is, can you shed more light on innovation as a challenge, not as a threat?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll probably come back to the second one here just to get a little bit of clarification. So I'll touch on the first one in reference to communication, right? So if you think about that stakeholder slide that puts those three components together, and if you really are an organization that's operating in the middle of those different stakeholders, if you have to be able to engage each one of those sufficiently and competently, and it's our ability to be able to talk about who we are, talk honestly about who we are, what we're trying to do, what some of our limitations are, and what our plans are to go forward. And that will connect people to our organizations. That will, people, as those of you who have been doing this work for a little while know, people want to become connected to the work you're doing. They believe in what you're doing. There are some people, right? not as much, right? There are certain constituencies that you can't get their attention, but that's okay because there are others that you can gain their attention. So the fundamental, when we look at the research about NGOs, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, sustainability has to do with your capacity to be able to raise funds, of course, but really the deep level sustainability happens when you are able to engage with your constituents, when you're able to engage with your community that's around you, and that includes all three elements there. So that's engaging with other businesses, that's engaging with others, and that only happens through communication. And the important thing too, perhaps around communication, right, is it's two-way. It's not just you talking, it's you listening. And this has a little bit to do with the innovation, right? And I think I know where you're going in reference to. So two-way communication. It's your capacity to be able to explain who you are, but it's also your capacity to be able to listen and hear what it is that people are saying to you about what their concerns are, right? And both those are tricky, and it gets quite challenging, which is, again, why I kind of like those little circles, right? Because as we think about our advocates, as we think about people who serve as champions for us, the importance of our inner circles help us interpret and understand what's going on.
Okay.
So the innovation question, want me to touch on that and see?
Yeah, very briefly.
So you said innovation in reference to how is it as a challenge? So is that the idea of always
Yes.
a new idea comes along? And
I think that the question is, how can we approach innovation as a challenge, not as a threat?
okay, yeah. So part of that communication mechanism, where we're hearing from our constituencies, where we're hearing from those around us, we know that our capacity to adapt, our capacity to be able to respond, particularly in an environment like this, is in many ways fundamental to our sustainability. So oftentimes we hold on to our core, right? We've been doing this kind of particular program, whether it's an after-school program, whether it's a study program, whatever it is, we've been doing that for a while. And our tendency is to want to hold on to that because it provides a degree of stability. But what innovation can serve as a threat, can serve as a concern for us in reference to the regards to how do we react or how do we respond. And again, I use those lines of communication. I use people around me to help me interpret and understand, but to be open to the idea that by and large, we're looking toward our objective. So as a nonprofit organization, as a leader of an organization where you've got multiple stakeholders and constituencies, we lose our bearing, right? We become oriented, we become too focused in on one, too focused in on another, too focused in on ourselves. Innovation can come in there and allows us to be able to say, how do I orient, but how am I focused in on my mission and my purpose? So how does this innovation help me achieve my purpose? So I ask leaders, I ask myself, does this help me achieve my purpose? How does it help me achieve my purpose? Will it help me? Does it has the potential to help me achieve my purpose? So I ask leaders all the time, I ask myself all the time to remind myself, what am I trying to do? What am I really trying to achieve? How does this innovation facilitate and that's where we get excited, right? We get excited because the innovation actually helps us see things in a way that we haven't done before. So,
Professor Brown, so I'm going to ask you a two-barreled question. The first is, one of the dilemmas that leaders of organizations face today in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's whether they should shift from their regular programming to programming that responds to COVID-19, because it appears the whole world and the international donor organizations are focusing more on COVID. So there's a dilemma. Should we just continue our program, or we shift our program to focus on COVID? And then tied to that is the question about how can a new organization identify and request for funding to finance its activities? I'm saying this against the background of the shrinking donor space. And perhaps it'd be great, maybe briefly also share some light on how these new organizations can fund some of their activities. Let me also ask another question from our participants, so you can just respond to all of them. This question is from, okay, I can see the name. That as a leader of a civic organization, how do I manage a community of leaders that do not support their work? And so how do they manage community of leaders that do not support their work? And my sense is, how do you secure stakeholder support? Because you talked about stakeholders in your presentation. And lastly, what are the direct impacts on citizens or civil society after this global disaster?
Say that one again.
What are the direct impacts on citizens or civil society organizations after this global pandemic? So this is more than a double-barreled question. There's
several there, but I'll try and touch on them, and I'll also rely on you a little bit, Sam, to help make sure that I get to the different ideas.
So the good thing is, if you don't exhaust them, we do have another second speaker. So I'm sure.
That's right. We'll get to them.
I will try to respond to this, so we maximize time.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate you feeding all those questions, and I know there's a lot coming in, so I want to try and be responsive. So one of the first questions was, okay, so we're an organization, we're doing something, but all of a sudden there's all this funding becoming available to try and do something around COVID-19 or pandemic issues, and how do I have to shift, right? So a regular threat or a regular challenge that any NGO, any international, any organization faces is, how do we balance our ability to respond, to react, even if that word feels better, to particular funding streams that are coming in regards that seem like they may or may not extend us. And so this is always a great conversation around, sort of mission drift, this idea of how do I stay focused on who I am as an organization, who we are as an organization, and the way we think about what we do. So the importance of the logic of our purpose, of our activities, I face it. Right? I have to think about sustainability of the enterprises that I'm engaged in and the way that they work. And I see what's becoming available, and I think to myself, how do we contribute to that work? How do we capitalize on the ability of funding resources, while at the same time being true and honest to some of the characteristics and features of who we are? And so there's no universal, and there's no easy answer necessarily, but I do come back to, while it seems like a trite answer, this idea of who are you? Who are we? Right. So as I think about who we are as an organization, so this is the Bush School and also the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, sort of the enterprise that I'm most concerned with at this point. I think about the limited set of capabilities that I actually have. What are the things that we have that feel like it adds value to the constituents that are important to me? And so if those individuals are connected and affected, as all of us are in this instance, to this pandemic issue, how can I help those constituents better understand how to operate and manage their organizations? Fundamentally, I'm about helping organizations operate more effectively or more capably so that they can achieve their objectives. That never changes. So that idea that my purpose, that rationale for why the center exists and why the work we do is never changed. And so it's a tricky balance, right? How do we balance between our ability to be able to respond to, but for me, it comes back down to who are we, and who are our constituents that we're most likely to be trying to serve or address. And some of that can help interpret how you approach a funder in reference to these regards. So I'll use myself as an example because there's thousands of examples of our work, right? But as you're working with youth organizations or you're developing youth to engage in a political process, and your work doesn't change, Sam. Funding may slightly adjust, but the fundamentals of who you are and what you're trying to do to achieve your objectives, to address the democratic principles of the governing systems that run for your country, that doesn't change in this environment. That was true then, it's true now, it was true 5 years ago. And so while the funding streams are going to adjust, yeah, and again, you know this better than I, but for each one of us, some of that doesn't change. And so it's not, I don't know if that answers their question in reference to shifting. In reference to new organizations, it's tricky. I mean, I've watched literally hundreds of organizations get started and to try and build the capacity. It's hard work. Don't anybody imagine that it's not hard work. It's exhausting work, right? It's 24/7. You're living the purpose of your organization all the time. I mean, Sam, you can probably even address this as well as anybody in reference to what does a new organization do? Well, you get back to the fundamentals. What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to help? Who are the people who care, right? So that one question was, what do you do when you got constituents that don't care about the work that you're doing? Yeah. Well, we're not going to change the mind of everybody. And that's part of it as well. And so sometimes you can, but it's an ongoing process of trying to maintain relationships. I can't, there's a lot going on in this world, and I can influence some people, I can't influence others. And so part of what I do is I recognize that there's a limitation to the number of people that are going to engage. And it comes back, and I don't mean to keep coming back to the mission as a core, but when you get in a world like this, you can lose your way so easy because you're scrambling for resources. You're trying to be able to be responsive. You got organizational systems that are only partially put together. And I know one thing, internationally based organizations always kind of assume that somehow US-based nonprofits are going to have all their, maybe you don't, maybe you know better, but they do not have all their stuff together. So I can go to a place in rural Texas, and I mean, the conversations I have about the way people are thinking about their organizations are surprisingly similar to what we heard. The last one was in regards to impact, right? So what do we do for our constituents? And that's a tricky one, because it sort of shifts on who we're talking about. Are we talking about the elderly? Are we talking about children? Are we talking about refugees? Are we talking about, right? So how do we think about that? But I see part of what I always am impressed with, and with organizational leaders, is their capacity to carry that message to other constituents. So part of what I look to you, Sam, and leaders like you, is to hear what youth in your communities are doing, so that I can figure out how can I help, right? And so you are a critically important conduit to channel messages. So if you think about the three diagrams there, that Venn diagram, right? As you think about the community and you think about the funding sources, guess who's in the middle? You guys, right? And that's why it becomes critically important.
So Professor Brown, unfortunately we're running out of time, but I just need to ask you this question. And what is the future of work? What's the future of development work in a post-pandemic era? One of the questions from our participants is, the pandemic has shown that teleworking or remote working is very, very possible. We're having this webinar. You're in Texas, also here, and everyone is at home because we're in lockdown in Nigeria. What will be the future of work? Are we going to see job losses? Are people in civil society organizations going to have to either sack members of their team because it appears that we can actually do this work by working remotely? So what's the future of work, briefly, before we invite our next speaker?
Yeah, I want to hear her talk too. So I'll provide a few thoughts on that. I certainly don't have the answer to that question. It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful thought. I mean, but we've experienced this before, and certainly this has pushed us. My wife's a teacher, right? So she is working with her kids in a way that she never would have imagined. So two thoughts. I mean, perhaps one is, I believe in local and community work. I believe in human connections. My training is in organizational psychology. I believe in human connection, and that we need to connect. We can do some connections in a virtual space. It's wonderful to be able to be here and share, but there's nothing like being in place together. So I actually come back to, there's tremendous value in being in place together. We are social individuals, social beings. So while a lot of our work potentially can be done at a distance, we can do a lot more. I just don't, it's not the same. I'm not convinced. We need each other. We need to be in place together. We need to be in community with each other. And so I still believe in the value of being in place together. But yeah, I suspect a lot of our work will change. I think we will do things. I think sometimes we won't travel maybe quite as much as we have done. I think that there will be elements that we will allow others to engage in our work, perhaps that we might not have been able to engage in before. I think education is going to be different. I think some of more and more of our education will come in a virtual way, which does sort of begin to shift things. So that's a few thoughts on the nature of work. That's a big question. That's very fascinating. I look forward to watching, right, as we continue to imagine what that looks like.
Okay, well, I think time permits, we can still take one more question. I'm sure this is also slightly tied to the question I asked earlier. And this is from Buki Shonibare. And she's saying, in a post-pandemic era, are there significant changes we should anticipate in the nonprofit world? And how do you advise as nonprofit leaders, and how should they respond to these changes? I know that in your presentation you did talk about this, but maybe we can, if you can just highlight what two significant changes do we anticipate in this non-profit world? I think that'll be great, because we have just a few minutes to wrap up your session. Just two significant changes in the non-profit world, and what non-profit leaders can do.
So obviously I'm an advocate of the sector, right? I believe in the sector as a fundamental core of who we are. We coordinate in the ways that I've sort of touched on already. And so I think that the future for the sector, we actually only continue to see its importance become elevated. And again, I don't have nearly the perspective that our next speaker does in some ways to answer that question, but I can talk about what's going on around me and around the things that we see in the US. So that from that one perspective, and from the insights that I get from folks that allow me to be able to understand what's going on in the international context. But I see more and more things being pushed or called upon for local community organizations to address the concerns of our social issues. So we can't do it without government. We can't do it without laws. We can't do it without a vibrant and important economy. But I think it's increasingly apparent that we can't do it without community-based organizations that are engaged with their constituencies and that advocate and that bring people together. And for me, it feels like that's never been more important. While those communities might be slightly different, they might be more virtual, they might be more connected across space than they had been in the past, there's still value of a locally based community organization and the understanding of those individuals that are there. So I'm not quite sure I fully got to that question or answered that question, but I see more and more reliance, to be honest with you, on organizations like the ones that people are leading. We're always part of a broader system. There's no doubt about it. We don't operate in isolation. We operate within all those broader systems. But I don't see a downgrading of value. I don't see governments rising up and solving all of our problems. I don't see economies, businesses, as much as a professor in a business school might want to advocate and say economies are going to solve all, Bitcoin's going to solve all of our problems. It's not going to happen. It's going to be a blended approach that balances these different constituencies, the different sectors, the individuals, our economies, our governments and our laws, and community-based organizations. I hear it consistently. Everybody knows that's but it's not easy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all of a sudden things are going to be, everybody's going to appreciate your work. I'm going to say that it's a critical component. So just one quick reference. So I get a chance to interact with, international leaders that come into the Bush School for a variety of things. Consistently, people who are leading countries, have been ambassadors, leaders of the U.S. government, consistently recognize that community-based organizations are a core anchor to how our societies exist. So I think I lost track of that question a little bit, Sam, but I come back to, as I say, I think it's where I started. I come back as an advocate. I think that while the work is hard, while it's complex, while it's not easy, while there's no simple answer about how we engage constituencies, how we communicate our purposes to people who don't believe in what we're doing, it's still critically important.
Well, thanks so much. I know we still have a couple of questions who are coming in, but I will just, because we've got about 4 minutes, let me just take this other question. And it's the fact about why we understand, this is a question, so why we understand the power of communication. We run a risk of over-communication, especially with regards to talking about our activities. We run the risk of over-communication as we talk about our activities, both in this pandemic era and in the post-pandemic era.
Right, because it talks about like one of
your brief thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I come back to the community, that we look for mechanisms to be communication two-way, right? So not only are we, so part of right. So part of what we hear when somebody says over communicate with your funders, right, is somehow that means I'm supposed to be doing, like, I as an organization or I as an organizational leader, I'm supposed to be doing all of the talking. I would just say that that's probably not true, actually. And you actually need to be doing as much listening as you are talking. And so to remember that the communication is a two-way street. So how do you have a mechanism to be able to listen? How do you have a mechanism to be able to hear what people are saying? So as much as it is, right, and I harped on this, tell your story, communicate, tell people what you're doing, yes, but also have you got a mechanism by which you can listen, which is again why I like those sort of circles, because I recognize you can't listen to everybody, but we do need to listen to certain constituencies that that understand who we are and that can begin to be advocates for us. And so building in ways to be able to not only communicate who you are, but to be able to listen. So this includes community meetings, right? So how do we engage people in our communities? How do we listening? That includes having a board of directors where boards connect us to the external environment and we're listening. We're not only communicating, we're not only talking at our board, but we're listening to our board and hearing the way that they talk to us about what's going on. It means being in place with our funders, being in sessions or talking to our funders in a way, but hearing what funders are saying to us about what's going on. So that becomes a much more dynamic mechanism than just simply blasting out one email after another or another social media post on our Facebook page, one after another, after another, after another. I hope that touches on it a little bit.
It does absolutely, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Any concluding thoughts?
I just look forward to hearing our next speaker. I'm excited to be able to hear her talk a little bit about her perspective and hearing that conversation as well. So I think I'm going to go on ahead and I'll close with that. I'm open to follow up. I know that one of the things that we talked about was people can continue to submit questions. I'm committed to staying engaged. I'd like this to be, I know that this is a long haul. It's one of the things we're hearing is it's a long haul. So I'm committed to garnering resources that I have at my ability. So I'm not the only one here at the Texas A&M University or at the center that is dedicated to what's going on. And so we're dedicated to being able to be a part of this and putting up some responses. So I'm gonna be online, but I think I'm gonna get out of the way.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure.
Brown. And what a good way to transition into our next session. Our second speaker is Dr. Amina Salihu, who is a mentor, who is a teacher, who is also a practitioner, and she's a senior program officer with the MacArthur Foundation office. She's a consultant, she's a farmer, she's a feminist. Dr. Amina wears so many hats, guys. And I think I'll just stop here, because if I continue reading her bio, I might spend the entire time just trying to introduce her. But I know Amina way back over the last 13 years. Dr. Amina, it's a pleasure to have you join us for this webinar, and over to you.
The honor is mine, Samson. Thank you so very much to Yiaga for this opportunity. It was a pleasure listening to Professor William Brown. You've actually made my work so much easier today. I'm going to be sharing my screen. And before I do that, I wanted to say a quick hello also to the colleagues who are with us today. And to say that my task is very simple. I would like to have a situation whereby you think with me and you locate yourself in the conversation that I'm about to share with you. So it is a story of what I'm learning in terms of what this moment means. It is also a story of my experience as a member of the fundraising and donor community. And let me put my card on the table to say that I'm a feminist. No ifs, no buts. And you're going to be seeing that coming through in the conversation that I want to share with you today. And as you listen to me, to also ask yourself the question, where do I fit in? What resonates with me? And I hope that you're going to have a lot of questions for me at the end of the 20 minutes that I have to speak with you. I have chosen to look at this conversation in terms of civic leadership and the intersection of that with strategic thinking. And what I'm going to be doing is actually building on what Professor Brown has already shared with you today, to then bring it closer home in terms of locating you as a leader in the middle of everything. And I've looked at civic leadership as well as strategic thinking. Of course, you have heard that civic leadership is about thinking about the quality of life of people. You're putting others before you. You're asking all of the right questions. But the issue is, even when you mean very well, it might be difficult to go very far unless you're thinking strategically. And that is a process whereby you're assessing the opportunities that are open to you. You're thinking about the opportunities that are there. You do not see problems, but you see challenges. Because even in the moment where we find ourselves right now, in the COVID-19 pandemic period, there are opportunities. And those are some of the things that I want to focus on this. I'm in Abuja, so it's afternoon my time. And to see how we then locate ourselves in terms of the future of our work and the future of work itself. Strategic thinking is very important, and I mean, for three sets of reasons. There are always competing needs. You've chosen your area of intervention in a community, but other people come to you and say, hey, we think you should do X, Y, Z. Should you go in that direction? Or should you ask yourself the question, is that my comparative advantage area, or are there others who can do that? The second reason why we need to think strategically is because it's a human rights thing. Inclusion is very important. Diversity and all of these things are just imperative. So sometimes we think we have our audience mapped out already. We talked about stakeholders just now. And then we forget that there are others who are minoritized. Minoritized in the sense that they are not few in number. Their voices have just been minimized to make them appear like they don't count or they don't matter. And when you're thinking strategically as a civic leader, you're asking that question, who else have I left out? Who else should I be talking with? Who else should I be listening to? And third, of course, is that ideas rule the world and they advance our learning. And as a donor or a member of a donor community, I can tell you that money always follows ideas. It is not the other way around. So you can write 1,001 proposals, but unless it is geared towards finding a solution, it will be very difficult to draw attention. Next, I thought I should speak briefly to some of the tools we need to have when we are thinking strategically. And Professor Brown has touched on a lot of them. So I would just be picking one or two that I think I would like to emphasize. And the very first for me is the values that we have, the belief that we have, the strength that is within that makes us say, there's something bigger than I am, and I care about others, and I want to make a difference. And we cannot make a difference unless you build a team. And sometimes I see people who come to donor meetings and they come alone. And it's only the boss at the top that knows all the answers. And I'm like, I'm gauging the values of this organization. I do not think when they get the funding, the work will really go well, or it will permeate the communities they should get to. Or they're all men and they're coming to a meeting to talk about community needs, when we all know that when government is not working well, it is women and children that subsidize the state. You have to think about personal and professional harmony. You know, COVID-19 is teaching us that. We're now working from home. We're now sheltering in place. So what it means is that we're working in new ways already. And it is not therefore impossible to work outside the office and still deliver on your quota. And I think what that is demanding of us, and I'll talk about that later, is some kind of ways in which we bring in flexibility to the way we work and define what really matters. Is it 8 hours in a day that matters, or the outcomes and the outputs that we need to deliver? Solidarity is very important. Sometimes the proposals we put out there that are better presented as a proposal of communities, people who are talking to each other because they need each other, working together, and thinking about participation. Participation not just of our teams, but also how the people whose lives we want to touch are part of our decision making, and how we also take back the knowledge we get to them. Sometimes we go into communities, we conduct researches, and we don't go back to tell them what the outcomes are or how we're using the knowledge we have gotten from them. We need to be able to humanize data. Humanizing data means you're thinking about your source of data and you're not seeing numbers, but you're seeing lives. It's very important. Innovation is another thing I'd like to talk about there. Innovation is really not something new. It's actually looking at old problems in new ways. And I have there a photo of the UN Women that is now thinking about how you can get men supporting women during the COVID-19 lockdown. Because we're learning that there are very serious gender implications to the lockdown. In South Africa, for example, we read that the police has received more than 78,000 complaints of domestic violence. Mark you, those are the ones that are reported. Women's work has increased. So how are men supporting families? Women's unpaid work, the work that women do to support families and the state, is worth $10 trillion, and women are not paid a kobo. If a woman does not cook that meal or get the children ready, they cannot go to school. Post this period, how do we respond to our colleagues, members of our team, members of our community that have to juggle roles? What is the new role for men as brothers, as fathers, as leaders of community? How are we looking at accountability? It takes me to looking at the COVID-19 world right now and what we are learning. Things are upside down, as you can tell. Someone said to me, and I'm sure you've also read it online, that we're in a situation of war. Because if you look at all of the things that we are asked to do now, it's the kind of things that you do when you're in a situation of quote and unquote war. You have to shelter in place. You have to scramble for resources. Some people will hoard. Some people will bring their best selves out. They will stick out their necks for others. And when you do that sometimes, and fear and panic takes over, it is very difficult to think strategically because you're only thinking about survival. And it is understandable. But this is the time also when we as civic leaders ask ourselves the questions: what are the most important prioritization that we need to have at this point? And how are we communicating that to the people who need to know the things that matter? Second is that, as you all know, we're very interconnected at this point in time. The coronavirus didn't need a plane ticket or a visa to cross the borders. All of the borders that we have are very imaginary. It has crossed and it has found us. but we have fewer safe spaces. Our children can no longer go to school. Going to the market is like going to war. You need masks, you need gloves, you need to be careful, you don't want to hug anybody. All of those things we're used to doing aren't possible anymore. And resources are shrinking. The world knows that it's at the cusp of a recession. And this will mean that the scarce resources will even be scarcer. We're losing lives. As we know, in Africa, right now, we have lost a whole lot of lives. Not less than 873 deaths in Africa. And that's one death too many. But in all of this, you can see the role of technology. And I can talk more about technology when we come to the Q&A section. To say that technology is an outlier that's changing the way in which we socialize, the way in which we see each other, the way in which we work. It is in fact the new oxygen. And it's going to define the world of work going forward. It's going to define the world of social interaction going forward. It's not going to replace what we know now, but it is going to define it. Communities are struggling, the informal sector is in disarray. And so I have this, you can see the infographic that I have up there, and it is a satire. It's a satirical analysis of the information that we get every day in Nigeria from the National Center for Disease Control. And this one says National Center for Hunger Control. So usually the yellow marker will tell you in terms of how many people have been confirmed to be positive. And the green marker will tell you how many have been discharged. And the red will tell you how many have died. And somebody has very satirically taken that analysis and sent a very powerful messages in the social media to say, look, you should be looking at the number of those who have eaten at all, who have not eaten at all, and who are dying from hunger. Because many of our people, many of the communities we serve only survive when they go out every day in search of food, in search of livelihood. And so this time, kindness and solidarity has never been more needed. My organization, the MacArthur Foundation, has had to say to our grantees, how can we help you at this point in time? Are there ways in which you want to work differently? Are there ways for you to become a COVID-19 leader? And that takes me to talk about what strategic leadership therefore looks like right now. Flexibility and kindness, it's so very important. We used to be very fixated, some bosses who are just boss, and all you can see are deliverables and timelines. You need to check in with your teammates. You need to check in even with your donor. You need to call your communities. And that's a good role that data can play right now, because you cannot go physically, but they can reach people. And sometimes a call can be one that saves lives. We heard about a colleague who thought they needed to commit suicide because everything just wasn't working. Locked in with an abuser, hungry, no one to reach them, but technology has come to help. Our children are learning now because they can learn online. People are developing crisis management tools, in terms of how do you use radio, for example, to provide psychosocial support to people who are locked in and cannot be reached. One of our grantees said to us, we have discovered that we can actually use 3D technology to print personal protective equipment, those gadgets that people at the front line of care need to use to protect themselves. And they can print it in country and get it out in quicker time and get it to those who need it. Community cooperatives are making masks and they're giving out masks. Equally important is the fact that people are countering fake news and disinformation. Because, as much as we're thinking about the value of communication and information, we also must be mindful of the fact that sometimes communication can have a dangerous subset where people will always benefit anyway from when things are from anarchy and when things aren't working well. And we need to pay attention to that, even as we think about humanitarian support and needs. Now, what will all of this leadership right now mean in a post-COVID-19 era? Because mark you, this too will pass. This too shall pass. It's a Corinthians analysis that we've all adopted a whole lot, a lot of the time. And I know in the Quran, it also says that Allah would never put on any human being a burden greater than they can bear. And so we need to learn the lessons that we of the moment. And one of the key lessons for me that I'd like to share with you as civic leaders is that solution bringers will be the ones that would have the attention of donors. Like I said earlier, money will follow good ideas. And we need to pay attention to technology in terms of the way it can save lives. Somebody just invented, we learned, a ventilator that can be hooked on to 7 or 9 people at the same time. And that will be saving more than one life at a time. That is very powerful. And how do we save the planet? We learned that India, for the last 30 years, I think it's Mumbai, has not been able to see the Himalayan mountains. But because India has ground to a halt for the last 3 to 4 weeks, they are now able to see the Himalayan mountains about 30 or so, 100 miles away from the city, something that hadn't happened in 30 years because all of the pollution has ground to a halt. We need to think about food security and livelihood. Right now we're battling coronavirus and sometimes we're not thinking as strategically as we might need to think. How do we deal with the situation of food security after this? Equally important is the issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are voices that are still missing in the analysis. I was very surprised about some state governments that are putting in place presidential COVID-19 responses and gubernatorial COVID-19 responses, and the voices of women and young persons and traditional leaders were not included. These are the people subsidizing the state right now. Why is that not happening? Attention to safe spaces in our organization will be very important. How are we making sure that our colleagues remain safe? Finally, and most important, will be activating the office of the citizen, holding power to account. And you can see the interesting coronavirus cartoon that I have on that slide. This is a high-ranking minister who cannot travel out of the country like they would usually do seeking for medical attention. And now they're taking him to the general hospital that he has built with the millions that he has stolen. So holding power to account will be very strategic. But I want us to close by holding at the back of our minds the fact that it's good to be young, it's important to be young, it's good to have the energy that the young bring to the table, but being young is not enough. You must have a transformative agenda. You cannot be a leader unless you're inspired yourself. And so my closing questions to all of our listeners today is, how is this period shaping you on a personal level, on an organizational level, or at the level of one who is an advocate who speaks for others and with others? And what opportunities and challenges do you see? As I was working on these slides, I saw an interesting something came in on Twitter, and I thought I should leave it here for you to understand what it means to be a leader and the kind of dilemma that you need to deal with and the kind of choices you need to make. And this gentleman is saying, well, during this lockdown, the government has said nobody should gather more than 10. And so that's the context of what you see here. His neighbor is having a naming ceremony, which means a lot of people are having a good time, but they shouldn't be all together. And he doesn't know what to do because the neighbor has promised him jollof rice. For those of us in Africa, jollof rice is a delicacy, so to say, made of rice and spice and sauce mixed together. And then amala is another one that is a favorite in Southwest Nigeria that's become a staple meal for Nigeria. And the guy thinks he has a dilemma. Does he have a dilemma? People laughed. You can see the number of retweets. You can see the number of likes. It tells you the power of social media. But I hope that people who are retweeting this and liking this are also thinking critically. Because should this be a dilemma, or should it be something that is not rocket science and it's already handles itself? So this period is about strategic thinking as concentric leadership circles, therefore. It starts with the personal, ourselves, what we do in our organizations, the way we engage with the state, and the kind of global connection that we bring back to the local. And as Phumzile Lambo Nguka has said, now is an opportunity to build back better, stronger, resilient, and equal opportunities. It is a time for bold prioritizations. I thank you for listening as I close with some resources that I think can also help you take the conversation further. Thank you as I listen to your questions.
Well, thank you very, very much, Amina, for such an excellent and brilliant presentation. I'm so excited with this presentation and the previous presentation because there's just some convergence in the issues that you all have raised. And personally, I'm inspired, and I'm sure our participants on this call have been inspired by these two excellent presentations. I would ask you just a few questions, and this is also flowing from the last presentation. And it's good to get your thoughts on what you think about the future of work and the role technology is playing. We did talk about innovation earlier, but are we going to be seeing job losses in the development sector as a result of either use of artificial intelligence or machine learning, or these new tools that organizations are beginning to use? And as a funder, what would be your advice to organizations on how, and leaders of organizations who are on this show, on this program, on how they can manage organizational operations as well as personnel management?
Yeah, thank you so much, Samson. I think the nature of work will change, but it will also still remain the same, like Professor Brown said, because there are certain things that we cannot change. We are social animals, and that was why I was very happy when the WHO corrected itself by saying it is not social distancing that is required, it is physical distancing. Because this moment has shown us more than ever before that we need our communities, we need to stay connected. So it matters that those who do that work, and it is majority of those on the line right now, whether on the donor side, on the government side, or on the demand side, continue to do so. But what it means is that we're going to see at our disposal new tools that help us do that more effectively. An example of a way of working that has come full circle and to the table now is in terms of electronic transfer of money. People need resources to stay alive. They need to be able to buy the basics, but the banks are not opened. So once upon a time in the communities, people will have to go to the banks to get their monies out. But now the ATM machines are working, the USSD code systems are working, where people can go to a place in their community and they can get out cash and they can buy the things that they need to buy. People have certain needs. They cannot find those who can help them. They're connecting with others via social media. All of those things would not change. Even if we were to have artificial intelligence, and we have been told that artificial intelligence is something that is the future of work, but you see, artificial intelligence will still raise certain human rights issues that only human beings can handle. The issue of data protection and rights. And the fact that it's garbage in, garbage out. Somebody still needs to program those machines to do what they have to do. But right now we're using artificial intelligence to prompt people. You can use it to help you remember the birthday anniversaries of friends so that you don't send them an auto message, but so that you can call them and they hear your voice. It's helping you see where you can buy goods cheaply. I'm a farmer, like you said. So I want to know how I can connect my community to how they can get fertilizer with using the e-wallet scheme. So our role right now is asking the question, at this early stage in the development of artificial intelligence, how do we ensure that the design factors in the needs and the aspirations of ordinary citizens? As a funder, it's very important that donors this time are very flexible, that they're very kind. And I gave an example earlier. I can speak to a few more in terms of what the MacArthur Foundation is doing. One was that at the start of the COVID-19 problem, even before the lockdowns began, we wrote a letter to our grantees telling them we have our back, we understand. If your reports are going to be delayed, it's not a problem. If you think you want to use your grant in ways that advance your leadership, let us know. If you think there are ideas you have, and that's how we heard about the 3D strategy of printing out personal protective equipment, we'll have your back. Second is that the MacArthur Foundation has what it calls an indirect cost policy. This is a 29% support to grantees, which is what we call liquid unspecified net asset. It is not for the grant. It is for you to strengthen your institution. It is for you to be there beyond a donor. It's for you to think of maybe social enterprise. What do I mean by social enterprise? You might decide to give a small group some money for them to make masks that they can sell or give out or whatever. So you're not making any profit, but you're enabling people stay afloat, and you don't have to report that to the foundation. We're thinking of what we call X grants. X grants are grants that are not part of our normal grant making process. So it's a quicker grant that enables convening, that enables coordination at this time. And as we move post the pandemic era, I would like to advise people who are at the end of receiving grants to push back to their donors. Donors are not, they're not people you can't approach. we're always also looking for ideas. And if you think that there are ideas that have not been thought of, I would like to suggest that donors keep their doors open. What do I mean by keeping your door open? You don't have to write me a 3-pager proposal. Dr. Kole Shetima is my Africa director. You can get on the phone with my Africa director. You can talk with me. You can reach out to Chicago, which is the head office of our foundation. And so in order to enable work be more productive for citizens and for ourselves, donors have to see themselves as part of that community. And philanthropy has to be much more humane. It is right now, but there's still more we can learn.
Well, thanks. I need to ask you a question about collaboration. And Professor William talked about that. What would be this? I wouldn't say the future of collaboration, but what would this next, call it the next level or post-pandemic collaboration between organizations look like? Because across the world, we're seeing competing companies beginning to work together to respond to this pandemic. You can see that even Amazon, for instance, is also, you know, producing test kits to test its own staff. And both tech and health and political governance structures are beginning to collaborate with each other. And I know that you have been at the forefront fostering collaboration between both civil society and media. What will be the future of collaboration between civic organizations in the post-pandemic era?
Good question. Our hope is that in the post-pandemic era, we're going to take forward something that we find to be working right now. And that is two things. Thinking about partnerships rather than competition. And second, thinking about how we maximize resources that are never going to be enough for our needs anyway. The way in which we have tested that right now is in encouraging proposals that are not just coming from one organization, or if it is coming from one organization, you're going to tell us the other actors, you have to name them that you need to engage with. And one such collaboration that we're very excited about in terms of partnership is that as important as civic leadership is, it does not have the authority of government or the power that government has. And at this point, we're beginning to see that even where government, so like a disease center, control center gives us the data every day, gives us the information every day, it is human beings who are feeding back that organization and saying, hey, you're missing this community, you should do more of this and less of that. So that collaboration is something that we hope would endure and be strengthened because each one brings its strength. Second, in terms of that partnership and using resources well, is that we hope that people will not think much about attribution. The thing that has always made collaboration become negatively competitive is the fear of attribution. So there's a predominant thinking that if a donor gives you money, they want to say, all right, Samson, I gave you X million. Show me what Samson has done to deliver this. Certainly, MacArthur Foundation doesn't care, and more donors shouldn't care about whether Samson comes back and says, you know what, I as Samson, I had to reach out to the 100 people on this call right now to say that, hey, we can achieve more if you did this at your community. And here are the outcomes. Here are the unintended positive outcomes. We need to look out more for those. And if we're much more humane in the way we make our grants, and we think about the fact that a work plan is not a locked-in tool, but that it's a dynamic tool and people can come back and say, I have found a new partner I never thought of, can I work in this way? We're going to be getting a whole lot more collaboration going. We have what we call the cohort approach. The cohort approach means that we make a set of grants at the same time. We have the same theory of change for that set of grants. We encourage them to see areas in which they can collaborate. And we encourage them to make reports that reference that collaboration and to use their monies in creative ways. So I think those will help us deal with collaboration better.
So I'm going to ask you 3 questions in a row, and I hope you can note them and maybe respond to them. So first from our participants is, in what ways can civic leaders provide support to members of their team during this time? You did touch on it, but I think there's huge interest in what practical ways can leaders of organizations provide support to members of their team. The second question is, how can community-based organizations access funds to support or help people at the grassroots level? How can community-based organizations? The third question is, as a young African, what is the best way to contribute positively to the current global pandemic with this lockdown? They're simply asking, please, how can I make a difference from home? Since you said technology is a new oxygen, you talked about data, you talked about new ways we can communicate. The last question for this phase is, as a leader, how do you work with educated communities who do not even know what is required from their leaders? What sort of accountability is? And let me also say that, yes, we've got Professor Brown, who is also on the call. Just in case you also have some perspective you want to share, please feel free to indicate. Over to you, Amina.
Many thanks, Samson, and to the colleagues for the excellent questions. So in what way can civic leadership provide support to the team right now? Practical ways. Depending on the number of your team, a number doesn't matter actually. I would expect that if you haven't done that already, some teams already tested out ways of working because they knew they were not going to be physically together. So they all did tutorials in terms of what kind of tools we could use, from Trello to Skype to Zoom, other ways, so that you can stay in touch. You can encourage a weekly check-in with your team to still talk about the work, but on that agenda should be, how are you coping? As a team leader, you might want to consider having one-on-one conversation with your teams, because people sometimes can't always open up when it's in a meeting. We talk in different ways. Professor Brown made the critical comment earlier about the need to listen. So as a leader now, you need to listen deeper for what people are not even saying, and to try to find the answer as soon as you can. You should think about how people make ends meet. Do you usually pay your salaries at the end of the month? Can you pay it a bit earlier? Do you usually pay it a certain way in the bank? Maybe now they can't access money from the bank. Are there ways in which you can help? Maybe now it's not about money, it's about getting, hardcore basic needs to them. There are many practical ways that you can actually show kindness. You're in a Zoom meeting and a child comes in and bombs the meeting. You have to be very understanding, because children have always worked from home. We are the ones who are barging into their space now working from home. So we have to accept that, the different kinds of challenges that come from doing that. And sharing information with each other is also very important. How can CBOs access funds to help grassroots? Very important. It goes back to the point that our moderator Samson had asked about how you collaborate. It's better to work as part of a collective than to work in smaller turfs. If you are at the grassroots and you're part of a bigger collective, it's very easy for you to know more about opportunities that are out there. It's much more strategic for you to know about the new trends in funding. It gives you visibility when you're part of a bigger established organization. As part of our own inclusion dynamics, we try to look out for organizations that are already big and established, but are thinking about smaller grassroots community-based organizations as part of their cohort. We like to see that, because we all started from somewhere one day and we got to where we are now. And it's good to think about succession planning and to help smaller organizations. NGO Source is something you can register for. NGO Source has different kinds of grants, sometimes that are meant for grassroots organizations like the one we're talking about here. And some of those grants are tailor-made for you. As a young African, what is the best way to contribute with the lockdown? It's true that we cannot move around physically, but there's a lot that we can do. My own thinking is that new leaders will be born of this period. We will learn that our governments are not necessarily leaders, but those who actually inspire themselves to inspire others are leaders. Number one, you can't be at the forefront of making sure that people get the right information they need. Disinformation and fake news is a virus of its own kind. And you know the facts, you have the capacity to fact check. It's good that you link up with fact-checking organizations and you're able to fact check. After this period, facts and their sacredness and investigative journalism I see them having an upper hand in terms of the way the world sees itself. You heard what happened when people thought that chloroquine was the way to go. And some people had an overdose of chloroquine and they lost their lives from what we heard. You can play a role as a leader. Some people have had movie nights where you watch movies at the same time with your friends and your family and colleagues. You're just watching at the same time and you're chatting with each other. Some people have virtual happy hours where everybody comes with a drink, you know, and you're showing your drink and you're telling us new recipes. You know, I think the president of our foundation calls it a quarantini, which is his version of martini. So let's see your kind of martini or mocktail or cocktail that you have, and just ways to humanize and to stay in touch. I have shared with my Christian friends a link I saw about, I think my Catholic friends especially, a link about how you can actually join Mass during the Easter period electronically. And some of them were very excited. So you can lead a community even when you are in one place. The fourth question, as a leader, how do you work with an education community that doesn't even want to know? This is a problem that we're all grappling with. And I think sometimes also we come with our own biases. When we think that people don't want to know, it might be that they don't understand what we want them to know. It might be that our approach is not the best way to go. In working with women at the community level, I've learned a very important theory of change. My theory of change is that if I want community women to pay attention to strategic things like political participation, like holding power to account, I have to start from the standpoint of addressing their economic basic needs. Because women are always at the short end of their time. They're always grappling with how to find more resources. And unless I'm able to take that burden away from them, they're never going to listen to me. So you might want to therefore use a behavioral insight approach. And what do I mean by behavioral insight? What are those kinds of ways in which people behave? What are the norms they understand? What are the things that incentivize them to listen to you? And then if your power mark tells you that, oh, these people are sitting on the fence, and you try this approach, they might just come on your side. But having done that, there would always be the die-hard people who are as convinced as you are, and you cannot convince each other. You focus your energy on those new ones that you have on your side, and you continue to work with them. You also use those who are already on your side to be your lever. A lot of the time we think that talking to members of our community doesn't matter. It matters. Just because they're on our side does not mean that we should not affirm them. You owe them information, you owe them analysis of what you're learning, and you owe them the need to ask them to even do more. And because you've not left them out, they'll continue to be your critical mass that helps you push. So don't give up. Let's think of new strategies and ideas, and let us always think about the other person's perspective, and I'm sure we will be fine.
Well, thanks. Inspiring responses. There are additional questions, and then I'll probably come to Professor Brown in case he also wants to chip in. Rojak Piuna says, as civic leaders, how do we ensure the growth of economy and the opening of opportunities for the youth, especially after the present pandemic, considering the cost of maintaining your organization, looking at the economic impact of COVID-19 on young people, creating those opportunities, as well as the cost of maintaining our organization. Bina, I think this is Bina Maseno from Kenya, is saying, seated at the donor community front, how are you and other donors responding to grantees who are shifting their programming to meet urgent constituents' needs? I know you talked about that, but maybe 2-3 ways you are doing that and how other donors can, because we also have other donors joining us in this call as well. So your thoughts will be very, very valuable on this issue. Another question is, how can we hold leaders accountable in the post-pandemic era, seeing how resources are being distributed and dispersed, and yet citizens are still facing hunger? And the last question for this round is, what do you suggest organizations whose donors are not willing for a shift in programming to meet the current realities do? So for organizations whose donors are not willing for a shift in programming. So these are another batch of questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Something, and the dear colleagues. How do we ensure the growth of the economy? This is a very important question because the economy is going to take center stage after now. We know that there's a fear of a global recession. Organizations are losing money. Those who have invested, even philanthropies that want to do a whole lot more. Private sector investors that are also coming into the picture are losing resources. And so it might be a period that becomes a bit more difficult for young organizations, for instance, to raise resources. And I'm going to talk about what young organizations can do or could have been doing, and also talk about people who are not even in organizations and where new opportunities lie. For me, I've always recognized that it's very important that when we write proposals in ways that think about that building the strength and the safety of our organizations. A lot of the times, the proposals that I see only think about delivering the work, and they don't think about this kind of moment when things will happen. Basic things like healthcare insurance, they don't even think about it. Other things that would help their staff members be motivated to come to work, they don't think about that. And these are legitimate things that we could have pushed back to donors, and we could have been using at this time without you even having to go back to your donor because it is part of your admin cost. For example, now, if you're going to give out money for your colleagues to use for data, which was meant for telephone, that would not be a strange thing because the situation demands that we shelter in place. Going forward, therefore, it's very important that you're able to let donors understand that you cannot do this work unless the organization survives and is in place. Some donors are more flexible than others, and that's something that you have to continue to negotiate. But most donors will understand when you say, I need to have X amount of admin cost. Now, what do you do with your admin cost? You should be able to think about social enterprise, the kind of thing that helps you support your communities to be stronger, to be better, that also gives you resources to stay afloat. You might get to a place whereby you're cutting down the salary you can pay, but you will not get to a place where you have to tell your staff to down tools or you stop paying salaries, because you have set aside something for the rainy day. Some organizations even have grants that go to institutional support and development. And it's very important that you look out for things like that. If you have not done that before, it's a lesson that you can learn. It's going to be very difficult right now in terms of what then do you do. But if you look at the fact that in Africa, and I want to tie that now to opportunities for young persons that are not even in an organization, as fertile and as arable as our land is in Africa, we're only cultivating 40% of that arable land. There's so much opportunity in agriculture. People need to eat. The entire value chain of agriculture needs to be made a whole lot more attractive. And it is the kind of social enterprise you can think of that helps your community staying strong, that keeps you on the right side of your donors, that helps you to grow your community, your organization, but also grow a critical mass of leadership. Telecommunications companies are always looking for young people in the communities to actually help them do their registration and to help them connect and to help them sell their wares. These things are becoming more commonplace in Africa. And we need to look out for more of such opportunities where we can give hope to others, but also we ourselves locate ourselves as key players. And that links me, if you will permit me to just take that last question about the seventh question I had about how we're holding leaders account. It's very important that we hold our leaders to account. And whatever kind of work we structure in the post-pandemic era, it's important that we're able to ensure that we follow the money and we ask the hard questions. Because even when we have enough resources, you're still not sure whether it's getting to all the right people or not. And unless you add accountability and effective use of resources to the work that you do, we really cannot maximize opportunity. So it doesn't matter whether you're in the health sector or you are in political participation or you're in economic empowerment, you must also think about accountability. And you have to be part of a network that is looking at that as their own main work so that you can also uptake what they're learning and you can benefit and also lend a voice to ensuring that the resources get to those who it should get to. Because when it's getting to those people, it will certainly also get to you hopefully.
Yes, too
Let
many.
me talk about,
Have
because
more.
I'm a donor.
Yes.
Yeah. So how are we shifting responsibilities? I mean, helping our grantees shift their focus. Let me give some examples, because I referred to that earlier, because I think we're running out of time. So one is that we wrote that letter, which actually made our grantees feel at ease, because when grantees, everyone is confused right now. So philanthropy has to give leadership. And that means you have to be the one writing to your grantees and saying, we understand what you're going through. We feel for you. Can you just tell us what will work for you at this time? Second is that when they get back to you, you have to give feedback in real time, because this period is a matter of life and death. You cannot go through that long period of grant making or anything. Third is that you yourself as a donor, you've got to make yourself very available, in the sense that you can listen, you can share ideas, and you can also ask the hard questions. The fourth is that it's not a time to go it alone. You have to also be part of the donor community. The UNDP, for example, in Nigeria, is creating a joint donor fund for COVID-19. And we are thinking of being part of that basket, even in addition to doing our own strategic work. And fifth and final is that sometimes grantees might want to do things that are not exactly related to the grants you've given them. But if there are people who are working in the community, for example, and they think that doing COVID-19 education will keep their constituents alive so that they will have people to talk to after COVID-19, then it's the kind of thing that donors can also make the logical connection and say, yes, we hear you, we see where you're coming, and we're coming from, and we think it's something that you should also do. And where you have donors who are not willing to shift your ground, which is my last question, still engage with them and document it. It's very important that you document your story of your work at this time, because it will serve as a lesson, not just to you, but to that donor. And do not stop asking. If there are examples of donors who are doing things differently, let the donors know. Because remember, just like you have hierarchies in your organization, we also have hierarchies. So you never know. It might be that that person needed that kind of heads up to have a chat in-house. Also, make your case in time and be considerate, and know that there are different layers that these things have to pass through. So don't say because, oh, they should understand this thing is important to me. It takes two to tango, or many more to tango these days. So you've got to do your own bit for you to also help them to be able to do their own bit. And so solidarity and looking out for each other would be the currency of the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Amina. I'm going to invite Professor Brown perhaps to also share some thoughts briefly, but I'm sure whoever asks this question will strangle me if I don't ask this question, which is about the digital divide. Because as you say, technology is the new oxygen. I'm sure Justin is asking that one of the biggest challenges for Northeast Nigeria, for instance, is using technology to advance civic education. How can his organization or organizations who work in that area use Facebook and Twitter in places where there's poor network or poor digital penetration?
Yeah, well, I thank Justin for this question, and it's very pertinent. The digital divide is something that is still there, and so technology is not going to replace the way in which we work. It's only going to make it easier. And we have to ask ourselves the question, if we did an analysis of the different tech tools that are available for us for civic technology communication, which ones are those ones that are low hanging, that are much more available to our communities? That's one. Second, how do we even further enable them have access? There's a whole lot more increase in terms of community access to the use of mobile phones. In Africa, before the present decade, century, sorry, we didn't even have many people using phones before year 2000, for example. In Nigeria now, we have about 140 million people who have access to phones. Some of those phones are smartphones, and many of them are basic, what we call touchlight phones, because you can use it to see in the dark when power fails, like it fails in most parts of Africa. Now, what it means is that you've got to use things like USSD codes in local language where people can have access. It is technology still. Second is that the radio is still technology, let's not forget. And there's a high listening culture in most of our communities. Right now, nomadic communities are being taught by radio because they can get the bandwidth anywhere. So you've got to look for those kind of friendly technologies. Second is where you have your communities that even have smartphones, because smartphone ownership is very communal. So I can have a phone in my house, but I tell you 10 people will have access to my phone. So if I'm the leader in my community, my organization should expect me to share information with others and cascade it down. If what I can do is to provide data to that person that has that smartphone, I should provide data so that they can do a whole lot more. But I agree, especially in the northeast of Nigeria, where we have a crisis situation with the IDPs, internally displaced persons in the camps right now. It's very difficult to talk about technology, but they still get their news. There are still people who work directly with them. They still have instances where they watch films, and you can use all of these mechanics to actually infuse. The most important thing is to reach lives and to touch lives in real time.
Well, thank you, Professor Brown. Do you have some sort of closing thoughts?
Well, yeah, this was an amazing session. Wonderful. Dr. Sally Hugh, thank you. That was excellent to be able to listen and get your perspective on this. Yeah, it's a challenging. I mean, one of the thoughts I have is that balancing work, right? So we have some funders that are going to respond and be adaptable, like the work of the MacArthur Foundation that reaches out to their donors, their donees and recipients and says, we're here with you. And some are less able to do that. And so as a leader of these organizations, some places we can reach our constituents through Facebook sometimes and digital means, and sometimes we can't. So, I mean, one of the takeaways is it's a very dynamic and complex environment out there to operate in. And I do kind of keep coming back to, and this was a message I heard as well, right? We look to the people that are close to us, and we look to the connections that we have. So the relationships that we have with positive funders, those are the key pieces. That's how we begin. That's how we have our effect. So that's some thoughts, but look forward to, we got a few minutes here so we can chat.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure being digitally sandwiched by a professor and a doctor who is also doubles as my mentor. But thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. I'm sure everyone who's joined this program has benefited from the vast knowledge and perspectives that you've brought to this. One thing is very, very clear, that in the post-pandemic era, civic leadership can make a difference. And that is why for us at Yiaga Africa and our partner, we're investing on this conversation. But I'd like to turn over to Jody, who will wrap this up. Jody, over to you.
May I say something before you turn over to Jody? I would like to say a very big thank you with a very warm hug to my daughter Farida. You cannot see her right now, but she's been my timekeeper. And this is the kind of solidarity and support that we need to appreciate after the pandemic era, because all of us right now are out on a limb and we're living on a lot of love and support of people who are not paid, but they're rendering very important service to us. And I just wanted to put it on record that Farida has been my partner all along. Thank you.
Well, thanks for mentioning. Aisha is fond of pushing young people. But just to add that we will be sending the evaluation and feedback forms to all those who have participated on this. So please look out for your emails. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you think about this webinar. Provide very constructive feedback. We want to know so we can improve for subsequent webinars that we will be hosting. So thanks in anticipation of your response to the feedback and evaluation forms that we will send to you. Jody.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you who participated. A special thank you to our speakers, Dr. Sally Hu, Professor Brown, and Sam Yiaga. We learned a lot, and today I would also like to take the time to thank the public affairs team at our embassy, our technical staff behind the scenes, including Dr. Sally Hu's daughter, Farida, if I pronounced that correctly, and the team members of Yiaga, if I pronounced that correctly, who worked behind the scenes to make this event happen during what are very difficult times. Just for all our participants to know, you can find a copy of this program, a video of this program, at youtube.com/US in Nigeria. That's youtube.com/US in Nigeria, as well as on this website that you're watching. It will be up later today. Additionally, on this website are the slides that both our speakers used. Remember that Dr. Brown has agreed to answer questions that you posted during the program, but we didn't get to. He will do his best to try to answer them. And as Sam mentioned, you will receive a form about feedback on this program, as well as what you would like to see in the future. We would like to know what you would like to see, what would be helpful to you. So on behalf of the State Department and our embassy, our guests, and all our participants, I thank you again, and I wish you good health.
Jody, before we finally sign on, I think it's important to thank Bella and Sterling and the field office for actually working with us on this. But we can't end by but also thank Lee, who has been working, doing all the test run, ensuring the technology, ensuring the lights and our sitting position. But I'd like to especially thank my team, Cynthia Mbamalo, who has been responsible for the questions, as well as Ibrahim Farouk and the other team members who are not here. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And we're very, very grateful. And we will continue this partnership as we put our hands together to build a world that respects human rights and provides opportunities for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.
You too.